Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's Mr. White here with some notes for you about inflation. So follow along and let's get started. Now, I think whenever we start on a new topic, it's really always a good idea to really explain what this thing is. And I think you might be asking yourself right now, what is inflation? I see all these balloons. What does this thing inflation got to do with economics? And really, why should we care about it? Well, sometimes the best way to answer a question is with another question, and I think we should start with a little example. So let me ask you a question. What if your boss told you, hey, congratulations, you're getting a 5% pay raise? If your boss said this to you, are you better off, worse off? Is there no change in your overall situation, or are you not sure? Pause the video. What do you think? Well, keep that in mind as we go through this presentation, because I will reveal the answer to this question. It may not be what you think it is. Now, before we can figure out whether or not your raise was good, bad, or something else, we need to define this thing called inflation. Now, here you can see an example of an advertisement from Coca-Cola from the 1930s. You can see it says, drink Coca-Cola, 5 cents. Well, that might seem really remarkable, but hey, believe it or not, Coca-Cola in a bottle was only 5 cents from the time when Coke first was introduced back in the 1800s up until around the 1960s. Now, you might say to yourself, well, okay, no big deal, Mr. White. Coca-Cola used to be 5 cents. Well, check this out. At McDonald's, hamburgers used to be 15 cents, cheeseburgers were 19 cents, shakes were 20 cents, French fries were 10 cents. This was back in the 1960s. Now, you would say, okay, well, yeah, those things are more expensive now. Back in the old days, they used to be cheaper. That's basically the definition of inflation. You've just defined what inflation means. It just means there's an increase in the price of goods and services. In other words, things are more expensive now than they used to be in the past. Now, when inflation happens, it diminishes the value and the purchasing power of our currency. In other words, it becomes more expensive to buy things because our money is not as powerful as it used to be. Now, the reason why this matters is because it costs more for businesses to produce things. There's an increase in input costs for firms when inflation happens. It also increases the cost of living for households. So for you and me, it becomes more expensive to pay our bills and buy all the things that we want and need. And it also increases the opportunity cost of holding cash, meaning that if you've got a lot of cash in your possession, either a lot of cash, like physical cash in your pocket, or cash in an account that doesn't pay any interest, like for example a checking account, you may not want to do that because what's happening is the money is losing value. You may want to turn that cash into something that's holding its value a lot better. We'll talk more about that later. Now, when we talk about the cost of living, just in case you're not sure what I mean by that, it just means that the cost of maintaining a certain lifestyle, like how much it costs to pay all your bills and do the things you normally do. And purchasing power, in case that was throwing you off, it just means the amount of goods and services that can be purchased with a unit of currency. So for example, how many things could you buy with $1? How many things could you buy with 1 peso? How many things could you buy with 1 British pound? How much could you buy with 1 yen? That's what we mean by purchasing power. Now, when we talk about the inflation rate, what we're talking about is the change of inflation from one period to another expressed as a percentage. So think of it like the speed limit of inflation. How fast is inflation rising? The way that we calculate that is pretty straightforward. Okay. For one thing, when we talk about inflation, the shorthand we use in economics is pi percent. So whenever you see me put up pi percent, just so you know, I'm talking about the rate of inflation. All right. It's equal to the second price minus the first price divided by the first price times 100. It's just basically a percentage change if you know that formula. Now, there are some other definitions you need to know. One of them is deflation. Deflation is for example, if you were to do this formula, price 2 minus price 1 divided by price 1 times 100, and you get a negative number, that's deflation. And if you're saying, okay, well, what does that mean practically? Well, practically, it just means that prices are going down. Deflation means things are cheaper than before. Now, disinflation is something different. Disinflation just means that the inflation rate is lower this period than in a previous period. What I mean by that is that prices are just rising more slowly, okay? So if deflation is walking backwards, disinflation is walking forward but just slowing your pace as you walk. Now, Hyperinflation, this last thing here, is like what happened in Germany in the 1920s, Zimbabwe in the 2000s, or Venezuela currently. Hyperinflation is an extremely high inflation rate, such that the money basically becomes worthless. You can see in Germany they're using money to light fires. In Zimbabwe, things got so expensive that they started printing out $100 trillion notes, as you can see here, which has a world record for having the most zeros of any banknote ever printed in the world. And currently right now in Venezuela, even basic household supplies like toilet paper can cost tens of thousands of bolivars, which is their money, because everything has just become so expensive so quickly. Now, stagflation, the last term here, is something we'll talk a lot more about in later chapters. It's just a simultaneous increase in the rates of inflation and unemployment. You may remember that generally, if unemployment goes up, inflation goes down because people don't buy as much stuff. But every once in a while, we can have a situation where unemployment goes up at the same time that inflation goes up. That's stagflation. In the U.S. economy, there are two main causes of inflation. And we're also going to talk about a third cause of inflation that luckily doesn't happen in the US, but has happened in other parts of the world, and it usually results in hyperinflation. Now, the two causes of inflation that are very common in the US economy are cost push inflation, which we're going to talk about first, and the other is demand pull. Now, cost push inflation means that the cost of producing a good or service has increased, and the producers in turn have to increase the price of their final good or service. So think, for example, if you were producing pancakes and all of a sudden the cost of eggs increased dramatically. Well, if the cost of eggs went up, we can imagine if this is the supply and demand of pancakes down here, the supply curve for pancakes is going to shift to the left. And so that means that if this was our initial equilibrium price, we'll call this P1, here's our new price at equilibrium, which is P2. And this is all because of the fact that we had an increase in our input costs, which caused our supply curve to shift over to the left. Another cause of inflation, as I said, is demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation is when the demand for a good increases so much that producers are going to have to require a higher price to increase their quantity supplied. This is especially common if there's a rush for an item. Like back at the beginning of the COVID-19 outbreak, there was a big rush for everyone to get things like hand sanitizer and disposable face masks. What that did was that caused the price of hand sanitizer and the price of disposable face masks to increase dramatically because of demand pull inflation. And so we can imagine that if this represents the demand for face masks and hand sanitizer, after COVID-19, people increased their desire, and what that did was that changed our equilibrium price. So if our initial equilibrium price was down here at P1, our new equilibrium price is up here at P2 as a result of that rightward shift of our demand curve, okay? And so once again, you can see in both cases the price has gone up, and so these are the reasons why inflation generally happens in the US economy. The third cause of inflation, which luckily doesn't really happen much in the US, is what's called the quantity theory of inflation, which just says that if a central bank increases the quantity of currency, meaning physical money, in circulation, it will devalue the currency that's already out there in circulation. And so the quantity theory goes like this. If the quantity of money increases, then money becomes less rare. If money is less rare, then it's going to become less valuable, and therefore producers are going to demand a greater quantity of money for their goods and services. So maybe one way to think of this, if you're having a hard time wrapping your head around this, is think of it like a pizza. Now, let's say if it's you and 3 of your friends, and you have a pizza to divide up. You can divide this pizza up any way you want. Let's say we decide we're going to have a pizza divided into 8 slices. Well, my slices are not perfect, but you get the idea. Okay, so if there's 4 of you and we have 8 slices of pizza, each of you could have 2 slices of pizza, and let's just imagine, for argument's sake, that it really takes 2 slices of pizza for you to feel full, okay? That's how much it takes for you to feel full. Am I right? Full. Okay. But what if some more friends show up and they decide they want some pizza too? Can you make enough pizza slices for more friends? Well, sure you can, but what's that going to require? Well, you're going to have to divide this pizza into more slices. We can do that. Let's divide our pizza up into some more slices. Here we go. Every slice we're cutting in half. Well, now we've got 16 slices of pizza, so you could presumably give more slices to more people. But the thing is that now every slice is smaller, so it's going to take more slices to satisfy your hunger. It used to take 2 to make you feel full, but now you can see here inside of our full box, instead of 2 slices, we need 4 slices. And so that's another idea about what causes inflation. If there's too much currency out there, it devalues all the currency that was already there to begin with. Now, purchasing power and inflation creates winners and losers. Okay, what I mean by that is that if your income has to keep up with inflation, otherwise you're going to be worse off in real terms. Now, let's think back to that question we had at the very beginning about whether or not you're better off if you got a 5% raise, right? The answer to whether or not your raise makes you better off depends on the inflation rate. Maybe you figured this out already, but suppose the inflation rate was 8% over the past year. If your boss gave you a 5% raise, does that make you better off or worse off or about the same as before? Pause the video, tell me, what do you think? Well, you're 3% worse off. If there's been an 8% inflation rate, what we're literally saying here, 8% inflation over the last year, everything is 8% more expensive this year than what it was last year. So if your boss only gave you a 5% raise, that means that you can buy 3% less stuff. Your purchasing power has declined by 3%. So even though you got a raise, in a way, you got a pay cut. Now, this is especially true for people with a fixed income. If inflation ends up being higher than anybody expected, so for example, if you were on a fixed income and your fixed income was based on an expectation of 3% inflation and we actually got 8% or something to that effect, you're going to be worse off. So there are some people who are, elderly and they're retired and they're living on a fixed income. If inflation ends up being higher than they expected, all their stuff becomes more expensive, but their pay stays exactly the same, and that can leave them in a bad situation. Another group that can get hurt by unanticipated inflation would be investors, people who earn income from investments with fixed interest rates. Once again, you'll notice this term here, fixed. Okay, that's really important. If your income is fixed, inflation is really bad for you. So like if you're a student like you with a savings account that gets a fixed interest rate, you're actually worse off when inflation happens because your money is not earning as much for you, or at least as much purchasing power as you anticipated. Another example would be banks that issue car loans. The money that they loaned had more purchasing power than the money that's going to be paid back due to the higher than expected inflation rate. So unanticipated inflation would make that group of people worse off. And the last group would be contractors, so anybody with a long-term contract. Like, for example, if you ran an IT service company and you signed a 1-year contract with an accounting firm, if there was unanticipated inflation, you can't change that 1-year contract. You still have to perform your services for the amount that you agreed on, even though that amount of money no longer has the amount of purchasing power that you believed it was going to have when you first created that contract. Obviously, if there's losers, there can be winners too. Like anybody who has an indexed retirement fund or something with a cost of living adjustment, and that's what this term right here, COLA, stands for, cost of living adjustment. It means that you live on an income that's automatically adjusted or indexed to change with inflation. So if inflation goes up, the amount of money you get goes up. And Social Security is that way. So somebody who has that kind of a retirement plan is not really affected by inflation. Another person who actually wins when there's unanticipated inflation would be borrowers. Anybody who borrows money at a fixed interest rate. So like we said, the person who loans money, the bank who loans money for a car gets hurt because the money they get paid back is not as valuable. Well, the person who borrows money to buy the car ends up better off because, in other words, they got to borrow the money. They got more purchasing power than they anticipated, and the money they pay back is less valuable. So they pay back less purchasing power than what they borrowed in the first place. And so that actually benefits them. It's kind of like they got a little bit of free money, and so unanticipated inflation makes them better off. And the clients, like if this picture up here represents the accounting office that hired that IT firm, they're celebrating when there's unanticipated inflation because the unanticipated inflation makes them better off. They hired that IT firm and agreed an amount of money they were going to pay. But now that amount of money doesn't have as much purchasing power, so they're actually kind of getting a cheaper deal for their IT services. So unanticipated inflation makes them better off. And so the basic truth here, guys, is that inflation creates winners and losers because it decreases the value of money. This leaves borrowers better off and lenders end up worse off. The reason why is because the lenders lent the money that was more valuable than the money that they got paid back. The borrowers borrowed the money that was more valuable than the money that they had to pay back. And so in that way, as I said, it creates winners and losers. All right, guys, that's it for video 1. Make sure you watch video 2, all about inflation. We're going to wrap this thing up.